James had worked at the cargo docks of Station Meridian for 7 long years. Nobody knew his name. Not the shift supervisors, not the pilots who came through, not even the other dock workers. He was just the guy who moved boxes and made notes on a data pad. Every morning he would clock in, load and unload containers, fix broken equipment, and clock out. That was his life. Simple. Quiet. Invisible. The station orbited a dead planet nobody cared about. It was a refueling stop, a place where supply ships passed through on their way to somewhere important. James didn't mind the loneliness. He actually preferred it. No politics, no drama, no competing for promotions he didn't want anyway. He earned enough credits to survive, had a small quarters in the workers section, and spent his evenings reading old Earth books on his terminal. That was enough. But everything changed on a Tuesday morning. James was in the lower storage bay cataloging medical supplies when the alarm started screaming. Not the gentle alert tone for minor problems. This was the emergency siren, the one they'd practiced for but nobody ever expected to hear for real. The entire station shook. He felt it in his bones, a deep vibration that sent crates crashing down around him. The lights flickered and died, leaving him in darkness except for the emergency strips along the floor. He moved toward the nearest access tunnel, his heart pounding. The explosions kept coming closer now. The station was under attack. Through the corridors, James watched in horror as the command center burned. That's where all the important people worked. The officers, the commanders, the station director. He could see the flash of weapons fire from docking Bay 3. Enemy ships. The Xylithians. He'd heard the news reports about them. A ruthless alien force that conquered systems and took what they wanted. He never thought they'd come here. James kept moving, staying low, using the maintenance tunnels he knew so well. Most people didn't even know these passages existed. Dock workers used them to move faster between sections. Now they were his salvation. He found his way to the lower levels, crawling through the darkness when the power cut completely. His eyes adjusted. He'd always been good at navigating tight spaces, at understanding how buildings were put together. It was one of the few skills that mattered in his job. The wreckage in the command section was absolute devastation. Bodies lay scattered. Equipment sparked and burned. James could hear voices but they weren't human. Deep, guttural, speaking in clicks and whistles. The invaders. He pressed himself behind a twisted piece of metal and watched. They were tall, with metallic skin that seemed to absorb light. Their uniforms had symbols James didn't understand. They moved with purpose through the ruins, looking for survivors or resources or whatever aliens looked for when they conquered a place. One of them stepped directly past where James was hiding. He held his breath. The invader didn't even glance down. James was small, thin, covered in dust and oil from years of dock work. He wore plain gray worker clothes with no rank insignia, no markings of importance. To the Xylithian he was nothing. Less than nothing. Not worth a second look. That's when James noticed something crucial. They were communicating through devices on their wrists, speaking in their alien language, but he could hear the pattern, the rhythm, the structure. Years of isolation had made James very good at noticing patterns. He'd spent countless hours alone watching how systems worked, understanding the logic behind mechanical and electrical operations. Language was just another system. He crept closer to the broken communications array in what used to be the station commander's office. The general, a larger Xylithian with more symbols on his uniform, was giving orders through his wrist device. James couldn't understand the words, but he could understand the tone. The commands, the responses, the strategy. James realized he was listening to their battle plan. Over the next hours, as the station burned and alarms wailed, James hid in the shadows and listened. He watched. He learned. The Xylithians had no idea that a single dock worker was observing their every move, understanding their tactics, memorizing their formation patterns and communication protocols. They'd killed everyone important, destroyed the command structure, taken control of the station. They never expected that the person who mattered most would be the one they completely overlooked. James had spent 7 years being invisible. Now that invisibility might be his greatest strength. He knew he had to survive. He knew he had to reach someone somehow and tell them what he'd learned. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was listening to. The Xylithians had made their first mistake. They'd underestimated a man they didn't even see. James spent the first night in the maintenance tunnels, listening to the sounds of destruction above him. The station was dying. He could hear the Xylithians moving through the corridors, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. He could hear them tearing apart the infrastructure, breaking into secured areas, claiming the station as their own. But James had something they didn't understand. He knew this place better than anyone alive. The next morning he ventured out carefully. The docks were eerily quiet now. Most of the personnel were dead. The few survivors were hiding like he was too scared to move. James had to think differently. He had to use what he knew. While the Xylithians were busy consolidating their control over the command sections, James moved through the lower levels with purpose. He wasn't running from them anymore. He was gathering intelligence. He started in the engineering section. The Xylithians had stationed guards there, but not many. They were overconfident. James waited until the shift changed, then slipped into the maintenance crawlspace above the main corridor. From there, he could see and hear everything without being seen. The aliens talked to each other constantly, updating their commanders on what they'd found, what systems they'd secured, what the station's capabilities were. James listened and absorbed every word, even though he didn't understand their language perfectly. But the numbers made sense. Coordinates, times, weapon placements. He pulled out a small data pad from his pocket, one he'd been carrying for years to log inventory. It was old technology, almost invisible to someone looking for modern military equipment. He started writing everything down. Not in words but in diagrams and numbers. The layout of their defensive positions. The number of soldiers in each section. The times they rotated their guards. For 3 days James became a phantom. He moved through the station in ways no one else could move. He knew which ventilation shafts connected to which rooms. He knew which electrical conduits could support his weight. He knew which observation windows were hidden behind false panels. He'd spent 7 years working in this station, learning its secrets, and now those secrets were saving his life. During those 3 days he managed to map almost the entire Xylithian occupation. He discovered they had stationed their main fleet in a defensive formation outside the station's docking bays. He learned that their communications relayed through the main tower on the station's upper section. He found out that they were planning something bigger, something that involved moving toward the inner systems where billions of humans lived. The Coalition fleet was still out there, somewhere beyond the debris field. James didn't know how far, but he knew they were monitoring what was happening. He'd heard officers talking about emergency broadcasts before the station fell. The fleet would be trying to assess the situation, trying to figure out if the station could be saved or if it was already lost. On the 4th day James found what he needed. In the ruins of the officers' quarters, buried under collapsed furniture, was a communications device. An older model that the Xylithians hadn't bothered to destroy because they'd already taken the newer ones. James grabbed it and ran. His hands were shaking as he powered it up. Would it even work? Would the battery still have charge? The device hummed to life. James's breath caught. He moved deeper into the maintenance tunnels, farther from any Xylithian patrols. With trembling fingers he found the emergency coalition frequency. Every station officer knew it. It was burned into their memory for situations exactly like this. He pressed the transmission button. Nothing happened. He tried again. Static. His heart sank. Then, faintly, a voice cut through the noise. A woman's voice, alert and urgent. "This is Coalition Command. Identify yourself." James's voice came out hoarse from disuse. This is a survivor at Station Meridian. I have information about the Xylithian positions and their tactical formation." There was a pause. He could almost feel the skepticism on the other end. But he pushed forward anyway. He gave them coordinates, numbers, exact positions of weapon emplacements. He described the alien ship's configuration, their defensive spacing, their weak points. He told them about the communication tower and how it coordinated all their movements. "If you hit them here," James said, pointing to the data pad in front of him even though they couldn't see him, "their formation collapses. Their ships lose coordination." The woman's voice changed. It became sharper, more focused. "Stand by. Transferring you to tactical command." James waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. Minutes felt like hours. Then a different voice came through, deeper, more authoritative. And for the first time in 4 days James felt hope. Maybe he wasn't just a dock worker anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he could actually matter. The shuttle ride to the cruiser Sentinel was surreal. James sat in a metal seat designed for beings twice his size, still wearing his torn worker clothes, still covered in dust and dried blood from the station. Around him were Coalition soldiers in full combat gear, their weapons gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. They kept glancing at him like he was some kind of curiosity. A ghost who'd somehow survived the impossible. When the shuttle docked and the doors opened, James stepped into a completely different world. The Sentinel was massive. The corridors stretched on forever, lined with advanced technology that made the station systems look like ancient relics. Soldiers moved with purpose. Officers shouted orders. Everything was organized chaos, the controlled rush of a military vessel preparing for battle. A tall woman in a coalition uniform approached him. She had captain's insignia on her shoulder. "James? I'm Captain Rivera. Come with me. The Admiral wants to meet you immediately." James followed, still feeling like he was moving through a dream. They took him through corridors and up several levels until they reached the war room. It was massive. Holographic displays showed the Xylithian fleet positions, the station, the surrounding space. And standing around those displays were some of the most important military minds in the coalition. Aliens of different species, each one clearly accustomed to commanding respect. They turned to look at James as he entered. An elderly human admiral stepped forward. Admiral Corvin. James had seen his face in briefing videos before the attack. "You're the one who contacted us," Corvin said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes, sir," James replied quietly. "I was at the station. I observed their movements." "Show us," Corvin said, gesturing to the holographic display. James hesitated for only a moment. Then he stepped forward and began to speak. He pointed out the Xylithian ship positions, explaining how their formation was designed for maximum defensive coverage but also maximum vulnerability at a specific angle. He talked about their communication patterns, how the lead destroyer coordinated with the others through periodic signal bursts. He explained how removing that single ship would cascade through their entire tactical framework. An alien commander, something with blue-scaled skin and multiple eyes, leaned forward. "How can you be certain of this analysis?" James met those multiple eyes steadily. "Because I watched them for 4 days. I documented their patterns. Military units fall into rhythm. They follow habits. These aliens aren't an exception. They're predictable if you know what to look for." The room went quiet. Then Admiral Corvin nodded slowly. "Prepare the strike force based on his coordinates." The battle happened within hours. James watched it on the war room displays, watching his analysis play out in real time. The coalition ships attacked exactly where James had said they should. The Xylithian formation shattered. Ships that should have been destroyed suddenly had clear escape routes. The enemy scrambled, trying to reorganize their defense, but they were too late. The coalition had the advantage. When it was over, James was still standing in the war room. The officers around him looked different now. They were looking at him with respect instead of curiosity. "Your next prediction," Admiral Corvin said. "They'll move their remaining fleet to higher orbit, trying to maintain control of the station while requesting reinforcements. But they'll leave their communications relay vulnerable for exactly 4 minutes during the transition." James studied the display. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the patterns he'd observed. The rhythm of their operations. The way their commanders thought. Then he opened his eyes and pointed. "If we strike here at their secondary communications array, we cut them off from their home fleet. They'll be isolated. Stranded." "Do it," Corvin commanded. Over the next 2 days, James's predictions proved accurate 3 more times. Each time, the coalition achieved tactical advantage exactly as he described. Each time, fewer coalition ships were destroyed because James had seen what the enemy would do before they did it. The other commanders began to treat him differently. A Krell officer, a being covered in thick armor plating, actually deferred to James when planning the next operation. "What do you suggest?" the Krell asked, his deep voice showing genuine respect. James wasn't impressive by their standards. He had no military training, no special equipment, no physical enhancements. He was thin and small and still covered in borrowed clothes that didn't fit properly. He had no armor, no fangs, no towering height. But he had something better. He had vision. He could see the enemy's next move before they made it because he understood human nature. And apparently, even aliens followed the same basic rules of strategy and fear and habit that humans did. Admiral Corvin pulled him aside later. "Where did you serve?" he asked. "I didn't," James said. "I worked at a cargo dock." Corvin's expression shifted to something between confusion and amazement. "Then how did you learn to think like this?" James shrugged. "I paid attention. I watched how things worked. I understood patterns." He paused. "I guess nobody ever taught me that I couldn't." And that's when the Admiral smiled. That's when James realized he wasn't invisible anymore. He was becoming someone. Someone important. The message came through just before dawn. James was in the temporary quarters they'd given him on the Sentinel, a small room that still felt massive compared to his old worker's bunk. He was reviewing tactical data on a personal terminal when the communication arrived. Captain Rivera herself came to deliver it in person. "The Supreme Commander wants to see you," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested this was not a casual invitation. Supreme Commander Vexthor. James had heard the name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear throughout the ship. The man was legendary across the coalition. He had conquered 17 star systems. He had fought in campaigns that shaped the entire political structure of known space. He was a living myth, someone whose strategic decisions had altered the course of galactic history. And now he wanted to meet with a dock worker. James's hands were steady, but his heart was racing as he made his way through the Sentinel's corridors. Rivera led him through sections of the ship he hadn't seen before, areas where the highest-ranking officers worked. Everything was pristine and quiet. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, like it carried weight and authority. When they reached the command chamber, James had to force himself to breathe normally. The room was enormous. Holographic displays covered every wall, showing fleet positions, enemy movements, supply lines, strategic calculations. It was a window into the mind of military power itself. And standing in the center of it all was Commander Vexthor. James had seen pictures of him, but nothing prepared him for the reality. Vexthor was tall, easily 8 feet, with dark skin that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. His uniform was covered in medals and symbols of rank that James couldn't begin to interpret. His eyes were ancient and sharp, the eyes of someone who had seen countless battles and survived them all through pure intellect and will. Those eyes focused on James, and James felt the weight of them like a physical force. "James," Vexthor said, and even speaking a simple name, his voice commanded the room. It was deep and measured and carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You have been analyzing enemy movements for this fleet." It wasn't a question. James straightened his posture anyway. "Yes, sir. I've been trying to provide tactical analysis based on observed patterns." "You have been doing more than trying," Vexthor said. He moved closer, his massive frame filling more of James's vision. "You have been predicting enemy movements with extraordinary accuracy. You have cost the Xylithians significant resources and personnel. And you have done this without formal military training, without genetic enhancement, without the advantages that most of my commanders possess." James didn't know what to say. He stayed quiet, waiting. "For 40 years I have commanded military forces," Vexthor continued. "I have studied under the greatest strategic minds in the coalition. I have implemented tactics that destroyed civilizations. And I have never seen anyone, human or otherwise, demonstrate the kind of intuitive understanding you possess." The commander paused. He extended his hand, a massive hand that could crush James's skull with minimal effort. "You are promoted, effective immediately. Your rank is now strategist first class. You will serve as senior advisor to this armada. You will help plan our operations. Your tactical recommendations will carry the same weight as any admiral's orders." James reached out and grasped Vexthor's hand. The grip was firm but not crushing. "Professional." "There is something else," Vexthor said. His eyes narrowed slightly. "The coalition has protocols for addressing senior officers. Protocol demands that I receive the title commander or sir, depending on the formality of the situation. Admirals receive the same courtesy. But you, James, are something new. You are something we have not encountered before." Vexthor released his hand and took a step back. "You will be addressed as sir," the commander said. "Not as a title of military rank, but as a title of respect. You have earned it through excellence and insight that transcends traditional military hierarchy. When my officers address you, they will say, 'Sir James' or simply 'Sir,' just as they would address me." The words hit James like a physical blow. "Sir. Not dock worker. Not invisible. Sir." "I don't know what to say," James managed. "You say nothing," Vexthor replied. "You simply continue to do what you have been doing. You observe. You analyze. You advise. You help us win this war." The commander gestured to the holographic displays. "Come. Look at this formation. I want your thoughts on their next move." James stepped forward to study the display. His mind immediately began working, seeing patterns, understanding the logic behind the enemy's positioning. And as he started explaining his analysis, he realized something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't just participating in strategy anymore. He was shaping it. The other officers in the room listened to him. They took notes. They asked clarifying questions. They treated his words as wisdom rather than suggestions from someone beneath their notice. When he walked out of that chamber an hour later, James wasn't the same person who had walked in. He carried himself differently. He spoke with more authority. Because now, finally, after 7 years of invisibility, the entire coalition knew his name. And they were saying it with respect. The tactical center of the Sentinel had become James's world. It was a place of constant activity, of holographic displays flickering with real-time battle data, of officers moving with urgent purpose. And in the middle of it all stood James, a human who 6 months ago had been moving cargo crates for minimum wage. He stood in the center of the room now, surrounded by beings that towered over him. The Krell commander who reached 9 feet tall. The Thracian officer whose scales shimmered under the lights. The Vextion lieutenant whose natural telepathy made him exceptional at coordinating fleet movements. Each of these beings had spent decades training for military command. Each of them had resources and enhancements that James could never possess. But they listened when he spoke. Their supply lines are stretched too thin, James said, pointing to the holographic display. They're moving faster than their logistics can support. In 3 days they'll have to stop for resupply, and that's when we hit them. The Krell commander nodded slowly. Your prediction follows the data. But how can you be certain they will not accelerate their supply drops? Because, James said calmly, I've watched how their commanders think. They're efficient, but they're also prideful. They believe they're winning, so they won't change their established patterns unless forced to. They'll stick to their schedule because they have no reason to believe anyone can exploit it. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. They underestimate us because we don't fit their expectations. They've never encountered humans before. They think we're weak. That's their mistake. The Thracian officer made a sound that might have been agreement. The human demonstrates understanding of enemy psychology, not merely tactical positioning. James had learned something crucial in the past weeks. The other species in the coalition were incredibly advanced in many ways. Their technology surpassed anything humanity had created. Their physical capabilities were extraordinary. Their military training was rigorous and comprehensive. But there was something they all lacked. Something that made humans uniquely dangerous when given the chance. Humans could think like underdogs. For millions of years, humans had survived on Earth by being clever. They weren't the strongest animals. They weren't the fastest. They weren't the most resilient to harsh conditions. But they could observe. They could adapt. They could find solutions in places others didn't think to look. Humans thrived in the margins, in the spaces between power structures where nobody paid attention. That was humanity's real advantage. James had spent his entire life invisible, which meant he'd spent his entire life watching. He'd learned how systems worked because he was too small to be noticed while he learned them. He'd understood patterns because he had nothing but time and observation. Every moment of his insignificance had been preparation for this exact role. 3 days later, James's prediction proved correct again. The Xylithian fleet stopped for resupply exactly as he'd forecast. The coalition struck hard, destroying 3 enemy destroyers and damaging 5 more. The Xylithians were forced to retreat to regroup. The battle turned decisively in the coalition's favor. But what happened after the battle was equally important. Military officers from a dozen different species started requesting James's presence in their command centers. They wanted his input. They wanted his analysis. Word had spread through the fleet that the human could see what others couldn't. That he could predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. That he was somehow tapping into a level of understanding that transcended normal strategic analysis. James began to understand the deeper truth. The Xylithians had made a fundamental error. They had looked at humanity and seen weakness. They had looked at individual humans and dismissed them as insignificant. They had conquered their way across space through raw power and military might, assuming that strength was the only factor that mattered. They had never considered that sometimes, the greatest strength came from perspective. From the ability to see the whole picture instead of just your own power. From understanding that victory wasn't always about being the strongest, but about being the smartest. One evening, James stood alone in the observation deck, looking out at the stars. Admiral Corvin joined him there without announcement. The old officer stood quietly for a moment before speaking. Do you know what makes humanity special? Corvin asked. I'm starting to understand, James replied. It's not that individual humans are more powerful than other species, Corvin said. We're not. But humans possess something that evolved in us because we had to survive without dominance. We're adaptable. We're creative. We see problems differently because we come from a position of vulnerability. The Xylithians conquered through strength. They never learned how to win through insight. James nodded slowly. He thought about his 7 years working at the cargo dock. Those years when he was invisible and unremarkable had shaped how he saw the world. They taught him to observe, to find patterns, to understand how systems actually worked rather than just how they were supposed to work. Humanity's greatest weapon, James said quietly, was never meant to be force. No, Corvin agreed. It was always meant to be vision. The ability to see what others missed. To thrive in the margins where nobody else thought to look. Back in the tactical center, officers of a dozen species continued to defer to James's judgment. They followed his strategies. They asked his advice. And slowly, throughout the coalition, a new understanding began to spread. The humans weren't warriors through strength. They were warriors through mind. The Xylithians had learned their lesson too late. They had taught the entire galaxy that overlooking humans was a fatal mistake. And now, as battle after battle turned in the coalition's favor because of James's strategies, every other species in the known universe was beginning to understand something fundamental. Humanity's time had come. Not because they were the strongest, but because they could see farther than anyone else.